been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.
This will be a lecture over Tommie Shelby's article, Race. This is an article from the Oxford Handbook of Political Philosophy. So I'll say more about that as a format in just a second. But I want to speak first a little bit to the topic of race as an issue in political philosophy. The last several lectures we've been talking about issues that have traditionally not been paid a whole lot of attention by what you might call mainstream political philosophy. If you go back to the classical thinkers like John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, fairly little is said on race except for when they're saying things that are explicitly and openly racist. So even if you go ahead to the more contemporary times, you look at people like John Rawls or Robert Nozick, they spent very little time directly addressing topics of race either. They were conscious of it at least, and they recognized it could be a problem, but usually they didn't tackle it head on. They tried to sort of tackle it in terms of their totalizing philosophy. For example, John Rawls would try to say that the veil of ignorance would solve all problems surrounding race and so forth. So it's been fairly recently that the topic of race has been taken more seriously by mainstream political philosophers, and it's still struggling in some ways to get, I think, a lot of the attention and recognition that it deserves within political philosophy. Other academic fields have had, I think, a more successful history at discussing and talking about it. But I do think there has been a shift in recent years, due in no small part to more scholars of color coming into political philosophy and making contributions and focusing and forcing a lot of white scholars to pay attention to the literature and to think more carefully and more critically about race through the lens of political philosophy. And Tommie Shelby is one of those scholars. So, as I said a second ago, this is an Encyclopedia article, and by the very nature of it, what it's trying to do is cover a broad range of topics. It's trying to introduce you to an array of different ways in which political philosophy engages with questions of race. And because it's trying to do this, it's a survey. It's trying to sort of give you a sense of the lay of the land rather than delving into the nitty-gritty of any one of these particular issues. So if you're familiar with any of these issues, you might be a little disappointed that Shelby doesn't do a deeper dive into each of them. But I do hope that there will be some other questions here that maybe you're less familiar with, and it might be interesting just to sort of get a teaser on these other issues that will invite you to think more about these aspects, even if some of these other issues are ones you've talked about before and thought about before, and maybe aren't breaking any new ground on. So Shelby, the key questions that Shelby is trying to address are these, quoting him directly. Whether and if how race should figure into our evaluation of institutional arrangements and power relations, in our treatment of each other within civil society, and in our self-conceptions and group affiliations. Okay, what does that mean exactly? That sounds very programmatic. That sounds like the kind of thing you expect out of an encyclopedia article, but let's speak a little bit more concretely. So some of the language that we hear in broader popular culture around things like racial equality or anti-racism, these are words that obviously sound really good, and I think most people want to sign on to them, but there's a difficult question of unpacking exactly what they mean. Some scholars, such as Ibram X. Kendi, have recently made pretty big names for themselves with books like How to Be an Anti-Racist. Those books, of course, get a lot of attention as they deserve, but it's also important to recognize that not everyone is going to necessarily agree with Kennedy's understanding of anti-racism, about what it means, so we should sort of consider a couple of different perspectives on that. So, for example, something we're going to come back to in more detail later on, should we be colorblind is a question that comes up here, right? What exactly does it mean to be colorblind in the first place? Is this a good idea? Is this something we should aspire to? How should we remedy past discrimination? Or, should we remedy past discrimination? What sorts of things, if any, should we do with regard to the history and legacies of things like slavery or Jim Crow? What today ought we to do beyond the obvious, things like teaching them in school and so forth, but are there other sort of social programs that we should engage in as a result of the legacy that those racist institutions leave behind? Another question we're going to look at is, should we abolish the conception of race entirely? Should we view race as something that's inherently harmful, and that an enlightened society should leave it in the past and move on to a post-racial society in some capacity? Or should we try to sort of salvage the concept of race in some way? Should we try to reconstitute it in a way that can sort of get rid of the harmful and noxious elements and instead have it used as a conception of something that is good and constructive and healthy in a society? So, again, we're not going to get to any sort of deep answers to any of these questions, but we're all going to explore them. So why don't we start with the question of exactly what is race and how should we think about race? What does it mean to be a member of a race or a certain racial group? This actually is something that, again, which might seem rather obvious, but there's a number of different approaches to it. The modern Western conception of race is only a couple hundred years old. It was sort of crafted in the 16th and 17th centuries, predominantly by white European settlers and colonialists, as a tool to establish a certain kind of power relation. The white men were the superior ones, and then the non-white people were inferior. So it was invented as a tool of white supremacy. So it makes sense that some people are going to sort of respond to just the history of race with a kind of skepticism. So the first view we might consider we'll call racial skepticism. This is the idea that race as an intellectual concept, as a social concept, is bankrupt. And what our aspirations should be, what it means to be anti-racist in this sense, would be to do away with this conception of race. Given that it was invented to keep certain people down, given that it was invented to empower white people over people of color, wouldn't the optimal solution be to just completely abolish it, so we stop dividing people up in terms of belonging to this race or that race? If it becomes conceptually impossible for us to see each other as members of different races, then racism will be practically impossible. We won't be able to keep people segregated or oppressed based on race because we will have left it behind. Racial skeptics will often note that there is no sound biological, genetic, or anthropological conception of race that can undergird the sorts of things that we often want race to do in our society. This is, as it were, sort of a pure social construct, and one that varies radically across time and space. So given how contingent it is, and given how harmful it is, wouldn't it make sense, the skeptics say, to leave it in the dustbin of history? Now, one way of understanding the skeptic's position is by contrasting it with what we might call classical racialism. And the way Shelby frames classical racialism is by adhering to four claims which are both false and harmful, as he understands them. The first claim is what's often called racial essentialism. This is the idea that there are certain things about a certain racial group which is just definitive of that racial group. There's something an essence of what it means to be white or black or Latino or what have you. That kind of notion, again, obviously keys into some sort of Platonic thinking, like we've talked about before in these lectures. Also, Aristotle was big on this sort of this idea of essences, even though his conception of essences was different. So there's something at the sort of the very foundation of a lot of the Western intellectual tradition that likes to view things in terms of essences. And so the classical racialism is going to sort of embrace that idea and say that there is something inherent about what it means to be white or black or what have you, that defines what those traits are. Second point is the idea of racial determinism. This is the idea that race determines certain kinds of aptitudes, whether intellectual aptitudes or moral aptitudes or things like that. Certain racial groups are just morally superior to others, this idea proposes. If you are a member of a certain ethnic group, then you're going to be intellectually inferior just in virtue of being a member of that group. Now, again, the determinist might allow for a certain amount of statistical variation, but the broad trajectory is still the same. The idea that one of the major impacts on whether or not you are a morally decent person or a smart person or something like that is your what racial group you belong to. The third component is racial hierarchy. This sort of follows directly from determinism, right? It gives you a sense that you can start ordering or ranking the various different racial groups based on the certain traits to determine biological superiority. So again, the key thing here is biological. The claim is that certain races are biologically better than other races, and by that same token, certain races are biologically inferior to others. And then the fourth and final one is anti-miscegenation. This idea that race mixing can have harmful, not just social consequences, but biological consequences. That mixing genetic material between white people and black people, or people of Asian descent and so forth, is bad for the children because it leads to sort of genetic defects and watering down of the gene pool and so forth. So I hope I don't have to make the argument that all four of these claims are both false and harmful. I think Shelby's on pretty solid ground there. And if the only two positions we could choose from was racial skepticism and classical racialism, then it seems like racial skepticism is almost certainly going to be the way to go. And so a lot of the argument in favor of racial skepticism plays off of the failures of classical racialism. And so skeptics want to say, look, the best way to undo the damage that classical racialism has had on society and on people, and to make sure that it doesn't happen again, is to just abolish the concept of race. So when you frame this in terms of a dilemma between these two views, the skeptics pretty clearly come out on top. But as you can imagine, we have other choices besides these two. These are not the only two options. So oftentimes people will push back against the skeptics by trying to explore other choices. So a group known as race naturalists sort of come back and they're going to agree with the skeptics. Sure, you're right. There's no such thing as a racial essence. There is no gene for being white or no sort of core set of genes that determines what happens when to make a person of this or that racial group. But in spite of that fact, that doesn't mean, the naturalists say, that race is biologically meaningless. There is a biologically useful sense of the word race that we can still sort of hold on to and use for a variety of anthropological purposes. If you think about this in terms of the broader issues in biology, Aristotle championed the idea that there was an essence of any given species. There's an essence of rabbit or an essence of fox and so forth. We know now that he was wrong about that. We understand now that species evolve over time, and that means that any quote-unquote essence they might have transforms and changes. So even though there is no species essence, nonetheless, biologists still talk about species. It's still a useful category, even though it's not hard and fast, even though species are constantly in flux and constantly changing based on environmental pressures and other sort of genetic drift and other factors like that. So the naturalists want to say we should think of race in very much the same way we think of species, not something that is inherent and unchanging and eternal, but rather something that we can use to carve up in a way based on legitimate biological history. Now, the naturalists are quick to point out that a lot of our common sense racial groupings, things like black people and white people, those probably aren't real. Those are almost certainly pure social constructions for a variety of reasons. But just because black and white aren't real categories, according to the naturalists, that doesn't mean there aren't actual legitimate groups that you can group together and say that there is a biologically meaningful sense of race here. Two examples of my own here. If you think about the Maori, who are the indigenous people in New Zealand, they had been population-wise isolated in New Zealand for a very, very long time, and it wasn't until Westerners started to come in that they actually encountered any sort of genetic cross-pollination from different racial groups. And the other example would be the Inuit, who are native peoples who live up near the Arctic Circle. Both of these groups have been genetically and reproductively isolated from other groups for a long enough period of time that you can meaningfully say there is something real about this racial identity. Now, again, that doesn't mean that it's an essence. That doesn't mean it's unchanging or that it's eternal or anything like that. But nonetheless, it isn't just a sort of pure, arbitrary drawing of the line to distinguish the Maori from the Inuit in the same way it is a largely historical accident based on political power that distinguished black people from white people. Another view we can consider is the idea of race constructionists. Now, the race constructionists might say, look, maybe the naturalist is onto something, maybe they're not. Maybe there is a biologically meaningful sense of race, maybe there isn't. But regardless of the biological foundation of it, the social distinctions are still meaningful in a social fashion. We shouldn't give up on black and white necessarily, the race constructionist says, even if there isn't a biological foundation for this, because distinctions can keep us connected to our history, to our culture, and it can have value and do something good for us. It might, for example, give people a sense of identity and a sense of community. We do have to recognize, the constructionists are going to say, that race was constructed for nefarious purposes. It was constructed as part of a white supremacist scheme in order to oppress people who weren't white, who weren't of particular kinds of European descent. But in the same way that race was constructed in order to cause harm to some people, in order to oppress them, we have the power to reconstruct it, to help racial groups, to try to fix some of the harm that has been done. Now, this is no easy project. No one would suggest that this is something that simply you can just sort of knock out in a weekend or something like that. This is long, decades, maybe even centuries-long work in order to critically sort of reconstruct our conception of race. But nonetheless, it can be a tool for good. It isn't necessarily a tool for ill. Now, while Shelby doesn't mention this term specifically, I think it's worth throwing in the term ethnicity here, because sometimes people will distinguish race and ethnicity in this sense. They will use ethnicity specifically to censure the cultural aspects as distinct from the biological or the anatomical conceptions, which are often correlated in ways that make for certain racial groupings. I'm not going to delve into this deeply because I want to stay focused on Shelby's way of thinking, but I was a little surprised that he didn't make this distinction, because it is one which is fairly common, both, I think, in popular culture, but also especially in academia in various ways. But like I say, I mentioned that for the purposes of the record, but I will stick with Shelby's language by focusing explicitly on race and setting ethnicity aside. So let's turn now to talking about racism as such. Specifically, what is it and how should we respond to it? Again, this might seem something that is obvious, might seem like it's obvious at first glance, right? We all know what racism is. Racism is the Ku Klux Klan and it's neo-Nazis and stuff like that. But I think if you pay a little bit more attention, you recognize there actually is a fair bit of dispute about whether or not something is racist. Is that joke racist? Is that Halloween costume racist? And people of good faith can have honest disagreements about whether or not a certain cultural artifact or expression is or isn't racist. So it makes sense to try to analyze it philosophically. Now, you could just throw up your hands and say, well, it's all subjective. Each person gets to decide for themselves what is or isn't racist. But that approach turns its back on the fact that we have to sort of share society together. We have to figure out ways to communicate with each other meaningfully. And so just shrugging our shoulders and saying it's all relative probably isn't a terribly constructive approach to the question of racism. So we can take a look at it from a couple of different perspectives, for example. We might ask, is racism simply a matter of belief? Is someone racist if they believe false things, if they merely believe false things about other races? For example, that they are intellectually inferior or that they are morally inferior or something like that. Now, on a certain level, of course, there obviously is something to this. There are people out there who hold such racist beliefs, and we shouldn't be afraid to call them racists. But the question here isn't whether or not those people are racist. The question here is that what racism fundamentally is on a psychological level? Is racism identified on the level of belief? Because if it is, then it seems like the proper solution, the way to respond to racism, is just to correct these misapprehensions, to correct these false beliefs by showing people facts. But if you ever actually have tried doing this with someone who holds in deeply ingrained racist beliefs, you probably know it's not that simple, right? Simply showing them statistics or evidence, that shows that people of different races are not in fact inferior, that when you control for relevant variables and so forth, that intellectually they're pretty much all on par, or that their IQs are pretty much the same, or whatever, however you want to sort of identify it. Oftentimes people will just dig in their heels and refuse to accept these facts. Oh, these are biased facts or something like that. You can't trust these facts. So it doesn't really seem like it's as simple as a belief. That's not to say that there isn't a belief component, but it seems as though there's something sort of deeper, potentially non-rational or even irrational ingrained in people when it comes to racism. So maybe what that suggests is that racism is a matter of non-cognitive attitudes. For example, fear or hate or disrespect. Someone is racist if they hate people of different races or if they fear them for non-rational reasons and so forth and so on. So the beliefs may be there. They may have these false beliefs, but they're sort of on the surface. What's really wagging the dog, so to speak, is the non-cognitive attitudes. It's these non-cognitive in this sense means attitudes that aren't true or false, and they're not propositional statements like people of that race are intellectually inferior, but rather feelings, rather sort of deep emotions regarding people of other races or other races as a collective. So this is, again, there's doubtlessly something to this. No doubt there are many racist people have these sorts of non-cognitive attitudes. But recognize that, again, if we're going to identify racism on this level, that seems to create certain complications for our moral assessment of racism and racists. Should we hold people to be morally responsible for their non-cognitive attitudes? If you are, irrationally afraid of flying, for example, is that something you're responsible for? You might know that flying is perfectly safe, but you have an irrational fear of flying, and you can't just stop being afraid of flying because you understand rationally that it's safe. Your fears and emotions like this, non-cognitive attitudes, are often immune to rational scrutiny or analysis or to other forms of correction. So if racism fundamentally is a matter of non-cognitive attitudes, then suddenly not only does it become a lot harder to know how we should respond to it, because it's really hard to change people's non-cognitive attitudes, it's also not clear how we should morally assess people who are racists or hold these racist attitudes, because it's not at all clear that people are morally responsible for these kinds of non-cognitive attitudes. We might bring a little more nuance to the picture, right? Does it matter if these attitudes are conscious or subconscious? You've probably heard a lot about implicit bias or implicit racism recently. That's a racism that doesn't exist on a conscious level. People might tell themselves, I'm not racist, I believe everyone's equal and so forth. But when you look at the way they behave, there's oftentimes subtle indications that they actually do harbor racial resentment or racial fear or something like that. Should we distinguish our moral assessment of racism between people who hold it consciously and people who hold it subconsciously? Because, subconscious racism can be just as damaging, sometimes even more so than conscious racism, than these conscious attitudes. But at the same time, again, precisely because they're subconscious, they're harder to understand, they're harder to recognize in yourself. And that seems like it creates, it possibly could create a certain amount of exculpation for a person who holds racist attitudes. They may do their best to purge themselves of all racism, but unbeknownst to them, they have these racist attitudes underneath the surface that they can't do anything about because they don't know that they're there. And how do we blame people for holding attitudes that they're not even fully aware of? Another relevant question here is about whether or not racism can be institutional. Now, again, precisely what institutional racism means, how we should identify it, is itself somewhat complicated. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, we can simply say that racism is institutional if it's somehow built into policies that are independent of individual attitudes. That is to say that everyone in the system could hypothetically be completely free of any racist attitudes, but because they follow rules and principles that have subtle racist implications, the system as a whole nonetheless can operate in a racist fashion. A way to see this might be to understand that there are examples of policies that on their face might be perfectly race neutral, but when you see how they're actually brought out in practice, you actually end up seeing racist consequences from that allegedly race neutral policy. A standard example of this comes from sentencing for certain crimes. So from 1980 till 2010, there was an example of what's called a mandatory minimum sentence. If a person was arrested with 5 grams of crack cocaine, the mandatory minimum sentence for that was 5 years. For powder cocaine, the mandatory minimum for 5 years, you had to have 500 grams, half a kilo, or over a pound of powder cocaine to get a mandatory minimum of 5 years. Now, on the surface, that is a perfectly race-neutral policy, until you realize that black people were far more likely to use crack cocaine and white people were far more likely to use powder cocaine. Now, biochemically, it's the same drug, more or less. Crack cocaine is basically just powder cocaine that has been cut with baking soda. A little more complicated than that, but you get the idea. So it's not like this policy can be justified on the basis of the kinds of harm that the drug does. This policy was written specifically because the people who wrote it knew that black people used crack more and white people used powder cocaine more. They didn't write that fact into the law, but they were aware of that fact. It was in the background. And so the end result was that African Americans ended up suffering much more harshly under the drug war than white people did. Not because the law specifically said target black people, but because of codes like this, which ended up having racist consequences. There's plenty of other examples of institutional racism, and we're not going to sort of dig into all of them. But again, there's a sort of an interesting sort of philosophical question here, right? It's about how can a system be racist, even if hypothetically all the people participating in that system are not racist? And how then do you fight back and respond to institutional racism if it's not a matter of purging individuals from the system who are racist, or purging racist beliefs and attitudes from individuals in that system? It becomes a lot more sweeping and a lot more harder to pin down if you can't just say, oh yeah, that guy in the white hood, he's obviously racist, let's just get him out of there and that will solve the problem. Racism is far more insidious, far more subtle, and far harder to solve than simply kicking out the people who obviously are racists. All right. Let's move on now to something I foreshadowed earlier, the question of colorblindness, right? Colorblindness is the idea that we should demand equal treatment in all spheres of life. That is to say that race should never determine how we treat people in any circumstances, in any capacity whatsoever. I mean, you can actually take this to certain extremes, like even to say things like, if you're casting a play, then if you're casting Shakespeare's Othello, which famously has a black character at the heart of it, that you shouldn't even consider the question of the race of the actors. You should just cast whoever it is that has the best tryout or something like that. Now, I think perhaps when taken to that kind of extreme, it might be a little ridiculous. If you're casting a play that is famously about race, you probably should be considering race in the casting. So let's sort of dial back from that extreme version. This sense of colorblindness, which I think is more plausible, is the idea that if we're talking about policies for things like who gets admitted to a college, who gets hired for a job, or so forth, those sorts of policies should never ever consider race as a factor. That's probably the more plausible version of colorblindness. Well, what are the arguments in favor of this view, right? How should we understand the idea that society would be better off if we were never colorblind? Shelby considers several, and then also sort of considers counterpoints to those arguments. So the first one, again, is somewhat similar to the race skeptics argument, which we considered earlier. When you look back at history, when people made discrimination on the basis of race, that discrimination was almost always very harmful to people. And so if we continue to discriminate on the basis of race, history suggests that it will continue to be harmful. And if we want to stop hurting people, this argument suggests, we should stop discriminating on the basis of race. Now, obviously, there is something to this. There has been a tremendous amount of pain caused throughout history by racial discrimination. No one, with even a passing familiarity with the history of race, can deny that. But at the same time, history is a little more subtle and complex than that, too. History also shows that race can be a useful factor in helping to redress that kind of harm. When you have hundreds of years of people being put down because of the racial category that they belong to, it makes sense to try to focus on race in order to undo the kind of systematic damage and harm that has been done both to individuals within those groups and to ongoing generations of those groups, even for people who aren't even born yet, potentially. So the sort of simple historical argument is sort of suggesting we blind ourselves to a relevant factor. If you are trying to heal a wound, sometimes you actually do need to use a scalpel and cut into a person's flesh. Normally, cutting into a person's flesh is harmful and causes a wound, and you don't want to do that. But if you understand medicine, you know that sometimes you need to perform surgery, things that might look harmful on the surface, in order to fix underlying harms that have been around for a while. Argument number two likes to appeal to this famous quote from Martin Luther King Jr. In his I Have a Dream speech, King famously said that he dreams of a day that his children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This is, obviously a very arousing speech, a very powerful sentiment, and it's a beautiful thing to imagine, and for a lot of people, right? To imagine a colorblind world where no one takes this into consideration. This argument, though, or at least this quote, is a good example, though, of something which is frequently called quote mining. It's when you take a quote from someone, which is a real quote, but you take it out of context, or you represent it in a way that makes it seem like the person who said it believes something that they didn't. And people who often are familiar with little of King's actual ideas and little of his writings know this quote because it's from the famous speech. But if you take a closer look at the writings of Martin Luther King and his many sermons, it's pretty abundantly clear that King was not advocating for colorblindness. A good example of this is his speech, "Where Do We Go From Here?" in which he talks about how to reform the educational system, and how the educational system had failed African-American children in order to benefit white children, and how we need to redress that. And the only way to redress that is not by embracing colorblindness, but rather by embracing policies that protect vulnerable groups like African-American children from the people in power who will often deliberately use their institutional power to keep black children out of educational areas. So the appeal to Martin Luther King here is not a terribly persuasive one if you actually take a closer look at his thinking more broadly on the topic of colorblindness. Okay, argument number 3 says that we should treat people according to what they can control. People only responsible for the things that they can actually impact in some way. And people don't have the power to control their race. They're born into a certain racial group. They're assigned into a certain racial group. There are some interesting gray area cases there. There's a phenomenon known as passing, in which light-skinned African Americans might often try to pass as being white and so forth. And there have been some high-profile cases recently of people who are actually born white and then try to pass themselves off as being African American for a number of reasons. But those cases are pretty few and far between. The vast majority of the time, it's pretty clear that people can't just choose to be a member of a different race. And so if you have this idea that fundamentally morality should be focused on how people behave and the choices that they make and things they control, and not focus on things that are outside of their control, then it seems pretty clear that we shouldn't be making determinations for how we treat people on the basis of race. An analogy here might help. If you think about someone who has a schizophrenic break with reality or some sort of a violent delusion and they end up hurting somebody, oftentimes people will say, well, we shouldn't punish that person because they were out of their mind. They didn't know what they were doing. They could not control themselves, and therefore they shouldn't be punished. And by the same token, we shouldn't reward or punish people for being a member of a certain race because that's not something that's within their control. This is a very Kantian sort of argument in a lot of ways. Now, the pushback to this sort of says that, look, there's a lot that makes a certain degree of sense on some levels, but on other levels it doesn't. There's all sorts of things that we cannot control for, but nonetheless seem like they're relevant when we're trying to make determinations about whether or not someone gets a job, for example. For the most part, you have very little say in how intelligent you are or how much dexterity, manual control over your fingers that you have. But whether or not someone has those traits seems like it's going to be a relevant criteria, for example, if you're applying to be a surgeon. If a person is incredibly stupid and clumsy and can't actually wield a scalpel well, you don't want to hire that person as a surgeon. Now, if that person comes back and says, hey, that's not fair, I really want to be a surgeon, and it's not like I can control how intelligent I am, it's not like I can will myself into having more dexterity, your response is going to be something like, okay, yeah, we recognize that's true, but that's not what you deserve, and what you have control over isn't the only relevant criteria here. We actually care about outcomes. We actually care about making the world a better place. And a world in which we have skilled and intelligent surgeons is a better world than a world in which we have stupid and clumsy surgeons. So even though it's not about what you personally deserve, we're going to give the intelligent person with lots of dexterity the job of the surgeon, because that's going to create the outcome that we want. By analogy here, I hope it makes sense, right? That we can acknowledge that if a white person applies for a job and doesn't get the job because they decide to give it to someone of a certain minority group instead, they might complain and say, "Hey, it's not my fault. I can't choose to be of an ethnic minority." And you can push back and say, "Yeah, obviously that's true, but whether or not you deserve this job isn't really the relevant consideration here. We're giving the job to the person who we think who is going to actually be able to make the world a better place in the right way. And in order to compensate, for example, of hundreds of years of racial discrimination, it might make a lot more sense to give an important job to an otherwise equally qualified person who isn't white, who comes from an underrepresented racial group." So to sort of wrap this section up, we one way of thinking about the difference here is to make a subtle distinction between the idea of equal treatment and treatment as equals. Racial justice on this way of thinking does not require equal treatment. It does not require treating all people, regardless of their racial background, the same. Rather, what racial justice requires is treating them as equals. So what that means in this context is taking into consideration relevant factors from their own background and from their own personal history and the history of their own sort of genealogical group, in order to determine how to act. So we have to make sure that we are fair to everybody, for example. But fairness doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to be given an absolute equal outcome. Now, again, recognize that this equal treatment versus treatment as equals policy can swing both ways. There's going to be times when we might want to, give a job to a person from a minority group, but recognize that that person just isn't really qualified for it. So we're going to give it to a white person instead. And if someone says, "Hey, that's not fair," you're not treating us, giving us equal treatment here. The last 5 people you've hired have all been white too, and you can push back and say, "Yes, but what justice requires isn't equal treatment. It requires treatment as equals, and that means looking at the person applying for the job fairly, not discriminating against them, but it also doesn't mean being colorblind to them in that capacity." So this is a subtle point, but it's a useful one in understanding oftentimes complicated topics in the area of precisely what equality and what justice from an egalitarian point of view requires of us. Okay, so next consideration. If we're going to agree that color blindness isn't the way to go, then we're left with a more complicated question then. Under what circumstances is it okay to discriminate on the basis of race? And under what circumstances is it not okay to discriminate on the basis of race? If color blindness is wrong, it means that sometimes it is okay to discriminate, but how do we know when that is? And as you can imagine, this is a very complicated question that's going to vary depending on the precise details and circumstances of the situation in which you find yourself in. Another way of phrasing this question is like this. When is race a relevant criteria, morally, socially, politically, economically relevant criteria for a kind of decision that we're going to make? And when is it irrelevant? When is it something that should not be considered? Now, again, there's some situations where this is unambiguous, right? Where it's pretty clear that treating a person as inferior because of their race is going to be unjustified. If a black person applies to be a surgeon and you just rule him out saying, "Well, he's black, of course he's not qualified to be a surgeon," that's clearly unjustified. And I don't think anyone today is going to argue about that. And there's going to be some circumstances where I think most people would agree that it is justified to consider it. For example, compensating for someone because they have been harmed, right? If someone attacks you on the street, you can sue them and get money to compensate for your pain and suffering and your medical bills. By the same token, it makes sense to say that if there's a certain racial group that has been oppressed by another ethnic group, then it makes sense to say that there should be some sort of compensation. Famous example from American history is the old 40 acres and a mule idea, right? When the slaves were freed, there was a program to attempt to compensate for the harm that was done to them by giving every freed slave 40 acres and a mule. And of course, it didn't work out that way. Many freed slaves never actually got that compensation. I don't mean to get into that. But right now, the point is just the principle of treating someone in a way different than white people. There's plenty of poor white people at that time in American history who would have loved 40 acres and a mule, didn't get it. But it made sense to discriminate on the basis of race, to give freed slaves that and not poor white people 40 acres and a mule, precisely because there's a relevant difference in how those people had been treated. So that kind of compensation for injury, if the injury is performed on the basis of racial lines, is I think hopefully a pretty uncontroversial example of when it does make sense when it's not wrongful to discriminate on the basis of race. But there are also some more complicated situations, right? What if you're in a situation where someone applies for a job and they don't get the job, and the employer says, "Look, I would love to hire you." We're talking about someone from a racial minority group here, and says, "Look, I'm not racist." The employer says, "I would love to hire you, but in point of fact, my customers are racist." Maybe this is like a restaurant, right? And they're hiring a waiter. It's like, if I hire a black person as a waiter, all my white customers are going to go someplace else. They won't want to be served by a black waiter. Now, I think that's terrible. I wish my customers weren't so bigoted, but the truth of the matter is they are. And if I hire you, I'm going to lose all my customers, I'm going to lose my business, I'm going to be shut down, and you're still going to be without a job. So it doesn't benefit anyone this argument goes, for me to hire, to be colorblind in hiring practices, or actually, for me to hire a person who is an ethnic minority, it's justified, this argument says, to not hire someone from an ethnic minority precisely because hiring a person from a minority racial group would end up being counterproductive. It would be bad for the employer, and it would be bad for the employee. It doesn't actually benefit anything. Now, this isn't a hypothetical, right? This is something that actually happened, and to a certain extent still does happen in many parts of this country and in other countries around the world. Left to their own pervasive racist attitudes will punish both people who are in racial minority groups and anyone who tries to help or hire people of certain racial minority groups. And so this sort of can seem like it's a gridlock, right? How if you have an ethnic minority, a racial minority that's in poverty, obviously one way to get them out of poverty is start giving them jobs. But if anytime someone tries to give them a job, the racist customers end up with a backlash against them. It becomes a poverty trap that's impossible to get out of. So it's situations like this that oftentimes will justify laws coming in and explicitly prohibiting people from making hiring decisions on the basis of race. Famous example in the United States is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The argument in favor of the Civil Rights Act to prohibit people from hiring on the basis of race. It wasn't just the idea that racism is bad, or that we should be colorblind, or that you shouldn't consider people's ethnic backgrounds. The argument was that we need an impartial arbiter here to make it such that no individual business can gain a competitive advantage by engaging in racist hiring practices and catering to a racist customer base. The rights of the individual people of color in that community to employment, to an honest day's work, an honest day's wage, overrides the rights of both the customers who don't want people of color waiting on them, or for that matter, the employers to make racist decisions about who they're going to employ. Now, Civil Rights Act is a fairly popular piece of legislation, but there are arguments out there, oftentimes from libertarian groups, that this is a violation of individual autonomy and the government shouldn't do this. So in spite of the fact that this is a popular law, it's not an uncontroversial law. So there is still a philosophical argument you can have here about the precise role of government in this sort of decision. Is it legitimate for them to play neutral arbiter, to sort of break the logjam, as it were, and to in so doing help people of color out of positions of perpetual poverty? Or does this transgress over the individual rights of customers and employers to make the decisions that they want to make in a way that allows them to perpetuate their own racism and potentially even racism in society? So this kind of leads us to a more complex version of some of these earlier questions. What should we do about past injustices on the basis of race? What does justice demand of us when we are being retroactive, when we're looking back at the past and recognizing injuries that have been done along racial lines? And there is no shortage of examples of this. Slavery and apartheid, genocide, Jim Crow, colonialism. These are not just, some of these are, Jim Crow is a uniquely American phenomenon in a lot of ways, but all of these have showed up in some form or another in different parts of the world, used not exclusively or always on racial lines, but often along racial lines. And, it can sometimes be tempting to say, well, that was in the past, but a lot of these things weren't in the past. Many people were in South Africa were alive during the apartheid regime, and it's still having all kinds of economic and social consequences. Jim Crow laws, and in many ways, are still echoing down. In fact, some people have argued that there's a new version of Jim Crow laws currently going on in the penal system. And while colonialism is not as popular today as it once was, there are still vestiges of it all over the world. So when you sort of see how much there has been, throughout, at minimum last 300 or 400 years, how much race has played an impact onto how various political and economic and legal organizations have targeted people of color, oftentimes to the benefit of white people, it can create a question of what should be done once we recognize not only that we should abolish these institutions, that's probably the starting place, right? To abolish the obviously racist institutions like slavery and Jim Crow and so forth. And the ones that maybe aren't sort of completely redeemable, maybe they can be reformed in some capacity. Now, again, that obviously sounds good. I think a lot of people can say, yes, of course, we should try to purge racist elements from our institutions. But you have to recognize that that's no small feat. There is a long and ugly history of racist institutions all throughout this country and other countries as well. The criminal penal system is, as I said a second ago, in many ways instantiating a new kind of Jim Crow. The education system is still really biased. We're over 60 years on from when Martin Luther King gave that speech. Where do we go from here? And there's still gross inequities in educational achievement. The healthcare system has a long and ugly history of not being available to certain people of color, and sometimes even performing grossly unethical medical experiments on people of color. The banking system is rife with all kinds of prejudice, and a lot of these things, while they're definitely worse in the past, still have shadows and echoes and remnants today, either within the system or as a consequence of these systems. So that sometimes leads to the conclusion that it's not enough just to abolish or reform. We need some sort of active program of reparations. Now, reparations is an umbrella term. It can take a wide variety of forms, but in short, what it usually means is having some sort of formal governmental apparatus to compensate people who have either been victims of racist institutions in the past or who are descendant from people who have been victims of racial institutions in the past. And the sort of the superficial argument for this is pretty straightforward. People who are members of racial minorities would be a lot wealthier and have much more access to power today if it weren't for the legacies of racism that kept them and their ancestors out of positions of wealth and power. Maybe it is incumbent upon society today to make up for the difference, to make them as wealthy, to give them access to power that they would have had were it not for these legacies of racism. But while that sort of superficial argument has a lot of appeal, I hope you can recognize that when you actually try to pursue it and put it into practice, it's a lot more complicated than that. How precisely should we trace the debt? How exactly do we identify the people that should benefit from the reparations, and how exactly do we identify the precise people who should pay it? Now, there's a lot of answers to these questions, but none of them are obvious or unambiguous. I mean, some people have unambiguously been harmed, of course. There's going to be some people who are going to say, well, if we have reparations, these people definitely should get some. But there's going to be other people where it's more of a gray area case. It's not clear whether or not they have suffered harm in the relevant sense to qualify for reparations. Now, these are difficult questions, but what I want to stress here is that while they're difficult, they are not impossible to ask. And so a open conversation, not just amongst intellectuals or activists or scholars, but between, I think, citizens and the American people about the question of reparations is frankly long overdue. And it's one that we should be having. And while it's not one that we're going to consider here today, I want to invite you to look into that conversation and to be a part of it, and to try to come into it with an open mind. Because whatever sort of knee-jerk reactions you have about the questions of reparations, I can promise you that there's a lot of sophisticated material in there that's probably not going to mold itself into your preconceived notions. Debt, much like wealth, can be traced historically, and debt, like wealth, can be inherited, especially if the value of that debt is still held. If your great-grandfather bought and took out a loan from a bank in order to buy the house that he lived in, and then your parents inherited that house, and then now you've recently inherited that house, and you find out that that debt has never been paid off, a reasonable argument can be made that you have to pay back that debt, even though you never took the debt out, because you now hold the wealth in that house. And that same sort of model can be used to argue in favor of broader forms of reparations, in particular for groups like descendants of slaves, for Native Americans who have suffered from genocide and relocation over the decades, and so on and so forth. there have been legislation on the books proposed in every single legislative session for the last 30 or 40 years, I think, to form a study group to look into reparations. Not to have reparations, but just to study it, to consider it. And every single time it has been proposed, it has been shut down. Congress is not willing to even consider the prospect of reparations. And whether or not you think reparations should happen, I think it's fairly straightforward to say that we should at least be willing to study it. We should at least be willing to consider it. Congress should fund a study in order to consider it. Now, if the study comes back and says that reparations is impractical, that we can't make it work, okay, that's something that we can sort of take at face value. But we shouldn't be afraid to ask the question. We shouldn't be afraid to look into it and figure out whether or not this is something that we should do, and if so, how it should be done. Okay, now in closing, to wrap up, we should ask ourselves whether or not a post-racial society is something we should aspire for. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, the modern conception of race is only a few hundred years old. It is not something that has been around for an incredibly long period of time. You go back far enough in history, and people would not be carving up human beings in the same way that we do today. You go back to people like Aristotle, people like Plato. They had bigotry, they had biases, of course. I'm not suggesting that they were paragons of enlightenment or egalitarianism, but they would not have understood our modern conceptions of dividing people up according to the racial groups as we understand them. So maybe what we should aspire to is moving to a point in history, some point in the future, maybe not within our lifetimes, but maybe future generations, in which we can leave race behind. We can go to a world in which race is no longer a category that the future generations will understand, a so-called post-racial society. Now, there's two questions here. Whether or not a post-racial society would be a good thing, and the second is, even if we agree that it would be a good thing, how would we go about doing it? Is it possible to put the toothpaste back in the tube, to put the genie back in the bottle, as it were? Even though we can acknowledge that it was something that is a relatively recent invention, that doesn't mean we can uninvent it. That doesn't mean there's practical steps we can take in order to go to a post-racial society. So one potential example here that's worth considering is the example of what's called self-segregation. This is a subtle form of racial discrimination in which people make choices which on the surface may not seem particularly racist, maybe it's only sort of mildly racist, but can have results that are demonstrably racist in practice. So here's a short video illustrating the concept of self-segregation.
4 decades ago, on a long-haul flight, the economist Thomas Schelling was doodling with a pen and paper and thinking about the problem of racial segregation. When he got home, he picked up a chessboard to continue his investigations. And you can do the same thing. Simply lay out alternating black and white counters, or brown and white eggs, remove any 20 and add 5 just to mix things up a bit. The board now represents a mixed neighbourhood. Now, these brown eggs aren't extreme racists. They're happy to live in a mixed neighbourhood, but they don't want their white neighbours to outnumber their brown neighbours more than 2 to 1. The white eggs feel exactly the same way, so take any egg that is outnumbered more than 2 to 1 and move it to the nearest acceptable location. As you do this, you'll find something astonishing happen. The brown eggs and the white eggs will separate out like oil and vinegar. Even a mild preference for the colour of your neighbour can lead to extreme segregation. Thomas Schelling's chessboard experiments became famous, and Schelling himself eventually won the Nobel Prize.
Okay, I hope you can see how that creates problems, right? Should we have public policies that prohibit people from self-segregating? That would require people telling people where they can and cannot live. They can't move into that house because even if their choice to move in that house has nothing to do with race, but because the way the racial composition of the neighborhood is construed, if we allow this, then we're going to have de facto segregated neighborhoods. There is a complicated host of questions here about how we could go about making a post-racial society, even if we decided that it was a good thing. So, not everyone thinks it is a good thing, of course. Racial pluralists reject post-racialism, and they may argue that racial identity can be a good thing. It can be a valuable thing. If we were to go to a post-racial society, something of value could be lost. A quote here which doesn't necessarily refer to this particular sentiment, but I do think can be applied to this particular sentiment, is the phrase, "We may be done with the past, but the past isn't done with us. If we try to blind ourselves to the racism in our own history, if we try to move to a post-racial society, we will be ignoring something that actually still has impact on us today. The past still impacts us today, even if we might like to leave it in the past. So, racial pluralists want to say we should not pretend as though we can just let bygones be bygones and move on to the future. We should, as the phrase sometimes is used, celebrate our differences rather than try to ignore them or to pretend that they don't actually make a difference. Now, yeah, exactly what celebrate our differences mean, it's kind of vague, somewhat more of a bumper sticker or a talking point rather than an actual policy suggestion. But I think it expresses a sentiment that racial pluralists can recognize. We are better off as a society if we embrace racial differences and recognize the different things that people from different racial groups bring to the table and the value it can have for all of us, rather than trying to move to a point where we no longer recognize the legitimacy of racial distinctions. So an example of this might be that oppressed groups can oftentimes reclaim a lot of power by taking pride in their racial identities. An identity which was once used as a way of discriminating against people can be disempowered and turned around. A non-racial example might help here. I grew up in the Methodist Church, and it was very interesting for me to learn later on that originally the Methodists were called the Wesleyans. And they got the label Methodists as a mocking term. People who thought that the Wesleyans were kind of silly by following sort of rigid steps of worship. How they have this method. Oh, look at those Methodists. Ha, ha, ha. Well, the Wesleyans decided to turn the tables on that, and they claimed the name Methodists for themselves. They took the power away from that label and turned it into something that benefited them rather than something that harmed them. Another good example, a non-racial example of this, is the label queer. Originally, queer was used to disempower, to oppress gay people or people of non-conventional sexualities. And a lot of queer people throughout the 80s decided, we're going to disempower this. We're going to take this back. On the racial side of things, the N-word, which I am not going to use, but I'm pretty sure you know what I mean. The N-word was, of course, originally used and still often is used as a way of oppressing black people. And many black people have decided to disempower that word and take it back and use it for themselves as a way of empowering themselves. So I hope these examples sort of show how taking pride in an identity, racial or otherwise, can be used as a way of taking power back from people who created those categories as a way of oppressing you. And this is what I want to close on right here, because sometimes people usually might sort of get confused here about the difference between something like white power and black power. Again, the colorblind society should say, well, if white power is bad, then black power is bad too. But I hope now that we've reached the end of this discussion, you can recognize there's a legitimate difference between these two categories. White power as a category was invented as a tool of oppression. It was a tool not of giving pride to poor white people who needed a sense of inspiration and dignity, but rather giving power to white people, but as a tool, as a way of disempowering black people. White power empowers white people at the expense of black people. Black power, as a category, it could potentially be used to just turn the tables. In some instances, it has been used in that way. But broadly speaking, I think it's pretty clear that it is a tool not for oppressing white people, but rather for dismantling the oppression that white people have imposed on black people. So even though, as on the rhetorical level, these two things seem equivalent, white power and black power, if one's bad, the other must be bad. When you look at the actual history and the way that the social dynamics have been used around these rhetorical devices, it seems pretty clear that a race-conscious society can make a meaningful distinction between the ugly oppressiveness of white power and the legitimate dismantling of that oppression that rhetoric like black power can use as a way of fighting back against that legacy of oppression.